Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a real honour to talk to you. There's quite a few things that I want to tell you about, so I'm going to try to move at quite a rapid pace to make sure that there's some time for questions at the end. And I was wondering if you could just sort of give me a signal for 10, when I'm 10 minutes from the end. Okay, so my name's Paul Howard-Jones. I coordinate a Centre for Mind, Brain in Educational and Social Contexts at the University of Bristol. But we also have this information network, which I think might be of particular interest to you. So if you don't write down anything, I think this website might be useful because there's lots of free information on there that you can download. And what we do is basic neuroscience. We do bridging studies to find out whether this neuroscience is actually relevant or important in the classroom. And then we get involved with actually developing classroom practice as well as indulging in public communication events and consulting with teachers. Actually, a little bit of my background, I used to be a teacher a while ago. Originally, I trained as a psychoacoustician, so I was doing postdoctoral research at UCL in the simulation of hearing loss when I decided that I wanted to be a teacher, and I worked for a number of years as a design technology teacher in a state school, then started training teachers, started doing educational research, and then got the opportunity to use brain imaging as part of that educational research, and then found myself actually doing neuroscience research and educational research at the same time at Bristol University, bridging these two areas. So it was a while ago that, in fact it was last summer, that I was asked to look into the impact of technology on the brain, and that question came about through anxieties about what technology was doing to the brain, rather than thoughts about its potential in educational senses. And there have been headlines generated, and you may have seen some of these headlines. Technology could be turning into a 21st century addiction. Facebook is infantilizing our children's brains. Google is degrading our intelligence. And I was asked by the Nominet Trust to review what we knew about how the brain interacts with technology and what the effects of technology are on the brain. And here is very, very much a sort of potted summary of what we found, but it will link into some of the other things I wanted to say, so I'm going to go through it very briefly. It's not about technology. Technology is neither good nor bad. It's about how we use it. It's about when we use it, how much we use it, and what we use it for. When we use technology is an issue. For example, we know that small, bright screens, such as you get on mobile devices, and some of these portable games consoles, are actually more disruptive to melatonin secretion from the pineal gland in the brain than watching television, for example, on the other side of the room. So it's hardly surprising that we find that teenagers who text after lights out are actually 4 times more likely to suffer daytime drowsiness. And it's not just a matter of rest. We also know that sleep is very important for consolidating memory, what we've learnt during the day. So if our sleep is disturbed, particularly slow wave sleep, which is a very important part of sleep for memory consolidation, if our sleep is disturbed, then what we have learnt during the day may easily be forgotten forever. Actually, I should probably say that I have 5 kids, and therefore all the time I was doing this review, I was thinking, what does this actually mean for my family? What should I do as a parent about this? And the report didn't really deal with that. We were just asked to review the facts, if you like. So along the way, I was keeping notes about what this means for parents, and I haven't really got any hard and fast prescriptive solutions to that. But what I have done is written this book, which is available on Lulu, and I'll give you the address of that in a minute, which really details my adventures as a parent and some of the real situations and barriers to that I found trying to implement some of the science in the home. So I can't give advice about it, but I do think that sharing the facts and the information and sharing experience about how we guide children in the use of technology, including our own children and our own family, can be a useful thing. So this is my daughter in the bottom left-hand corner, nesting and sending texts out at night, and my eldest son as well. So what you use technologies for is also important. For example, and I find this study very interesting because this is about a group of 13 to 14-year-olds who were allowed to use different types of technology between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening only. Right? And then they did a memory exercise similar to you might find for homework. So it was kind of like a controlled homework exercise where they had to remember the information. And what I find interesting about this study is that I think this is a very well-managed household because they only used technology between 6 and 7 and then they did their homework. But nevertheless, we look at the disruption on slow-wave sleep and we find that in the basal condition, which is when they were using no technology, slow-wave sleep during the night accounted for around 30%, the highest percentage of total sleep gained that night. Remember, slow-wave sleep is the important part of the sleep for memory consolidation. Those who watched television actually enjoyed less slow-wave sleep, and those who enjoyed the least slow-wave sleep were those who'd been playing computer games between 6 and 7 o'clock. The bottom graph shows the percentage memory loss for what they encountered after that experience. So if you like, this is how much of their homework was a waste of time. We find that the least memory loss was for the base conditions, where they were using no technology. If they used television, then they actually suffered twice as much memory loss. But the most memory loss were for those children who were playing computer games between 6 and 7. Now, all this is pointing towards an interesting fact, really. And this is another thing that's related to that fact, or that fact. Should I call it a fact? Okay, a possibility. Children's exercise is also disrupted if use is excessive. And use can be excessive because we know that for a small percentage of the population, and that percentage varies according to the measurements used and according to the cultures in which that measurement is made, but we all agree that for some percentage of the population, the amount of technology use is excessive and problematic. There's no time limit to that. We can't say once you're using 6 hours, 10 hours of technology a day, then that's a problem. Problematic is defined in terms of its disruption of other activities, healthy activities, including those activities that you want to pursue but find yourself now unable to. So somewhere between 1.5 and 8.2% of the general population have problematic internet use. There is some discussion and controversy around whether this should be seen as a special disorder, because if we decide that it is an official psychiatric disorder, we also have to include other candidates for psychiatric disorders, such as those people who can't stop shopping, can't stop working, can't stop playing football or whatever. On the other hand, this is actually quite prevalent, and it's just one statistic that tells us this interesting thing, really, because what are they doing on the internet? Well, if they're adults, these excessive technology users, if they're adults, they're looking at pornography, or they are pursuing illicit relationships. So if you know somebody who's obsessed with using the internet to the point whereby it's interfering with their day-to-day lives, then you'll find that they're probably doing one of those two things if they're an adult. On the other hand, our young people are of better moral standing, luckily, and they are most likely, if they're problematic internet users, they are most likely to be spending their time gaming. And this is the really interesting point, which has positive implications as well as negative implications. Video games appear to be very, very engaging. They engage the brain in a way in which other environmental stimuli don't. When players view images from internet games, we see similar neural activities as when addicts of drugs or pathological gamblers view images of casinos or playing cards or whatever their habit tends to be. In fact, in the bottom right-hand corner there, you can see a device that I put together in my garden shed to try to control my own son's video game use. And I don't know if any of you have had these sort of problems, but trying to get them to turn off the video game can be quite an issue. So I've resorted to using digital timers wrapped up in locked boxes that then cuts out electricity to the entire bedroom. So 9 o'clock. Desperate times call for desperate measures, but I can recommend it. There's no arguments, weirdly, but anyway. Okay, so the point is that video games are very engaging. Why are they so engaging? Well, games, like many pleasures, stimulate the brain's reward system. Now, we're talking about pleasures like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, all those visceral things that when you see them, you just want them. Significant dopamine release occurs in the midbrain, and it's comparable to the effects of psychostimulant drugs such as Ritalin, otherwise known as methylphenidate, and some amphetamines. And in fact, if you did apply mental health criteria, you'd find even in 98, 20% of our teenagers addicted to video games. So this all points to this interesting fact, or argument, or whatever, that games appear to be a special stimulus for the brain. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that apart from providing this very rapid schedule of rewards, like few other activities, so you do something and then you get feedback, you get points or whatever. These rewards are uncertain. They are chance-based. And this monkey can tell us something about why that's an issue, why that's interesting. This monkey is having its dopamine measured while it's looking at visual patterns. Now, in the past, some of these visual patterns, I don't think I've got a pointer here, have I? No, I won't touch that. There's no laser pointer. If you see in the blue there, the conditioned stimulus is the pattern coming on. So it comes on, that's the square wave, and then it goes off. And at the end, there's a little blip there that represents possibly a drop of honey. That's the reward. Now, in the past, when it's been watching these patterns, some of these visual patterns have always been associated with a little drop of honey at the end. So it knows when it sees the pattern, it's going to get a reward. There's a probability of 1. It's 100% certain. When it sees the reward, and I'm talking now about the green trace at the top, p equals 1. When it sees the pattern, it knows it's going to get a reward. There's a spike of dopamine. When the actual reward arrives, there is no dopamine because the event was so predictable. In the bottom green line there, you can see what happens when it sees a visual pattern that has never been associated with reward. So there's no spike of dopamine when it sees the pattern. But when the reward unexpectedly arrives, it says, oh, thank you very much, I want that. There's an element of a desire, and you get a spike of dopamine. But the really interesting thing is what happens when it sees a pattern that half the times historically have been associated with getting reward, and on half of the occasions has not produced a reward. 50-50 uncertainty as to whether it's going to get a reward or not. Then we get a spike of dopamine similar to when it knew it was going to receive a reward, and then the dopamine ramps up until the outcome is known. Now, if you integrate over time, that means there's more dopamine sloshing around for uncertain reward than either wholly predictable reward or wholly unexpected reward. Now, that means that uncertain rewards of the type we receive in video games are more stimulating than simply, knowing that you're going to get one. And dopamine's important because not only does it orientate our attention, but it also enhances synaptoplasticity. That's the making of connections between neurons. That's the basis of learning. So it also accelerates the process of learning. In fact, rewards, how many gold stars do you give your students, does not predict whether they remember that situation. It does not predict learning, and it doesn't predict whether they're able to recall information either. What does predict those things is the response of the brain's reward system. So if we understand how the brain's reward system responds, then we have a better understanding of how we can support learning. And this shows you a nice straight line graph of memory going up the right-hand side, and along the horizontal memory going up the vertical axis, and along the horizontal axis we have activity in the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens used to be called the pleasure centre of the brain. We now know that it's the desire centre. The more you want something, the more the nucleus accumbens will be activated. Now, we don't completely understand the processes by which this occurs, and this is an area of research, but the important thing is that it does. It probably occurs directly by dopamine being generated in other areas of the cortex. But it does help explain why video games are incredible teachers. Action video games improve performance on many visual motor tasks. They improve the switching of visual attention. They improve your ability to suppress visual distraction. They improve your ability to infer an action's probable outcome. They can even improve your contrast sensitivity over a relatively short period of time. We're talking here about 10, 20 hours of play. And contrast sensitivity is the primary factor that limits sight. Now, scientists have been trying to do these things for decades, and we find that action video games have been doing them in lounges and bedrooms around the world for years. And the important thing is that it's not just that they get better on the video game in terms of these cognitive functions. These cognitive functions actually transfer, this enhancement of cognitive function transfers to other areas as well. It's not a self-selection effect. It's not just that people who have these abilities choose to play video games. You can take non-game players and find that after 10 hours of play, some of these abilities begin to be enhanced. We see longitudinal studies that track improvements in relation to how much people are playing their action video games. And of the few studies undertaken, we can see that they transfer to some professional activities. So surgeons who play Wii games tend to have better laparoscopic skills, and playing a Wii game can be used to enhance laparoscopic keyhole surgery skills. The Israeli Defense Force insists that its fighter pilots play action video games because they know they improve their performance in the air. Reportedly, this is also true for drone piloting, but the US Defense Force has closed down on any public statements about that because it was so controversial. You can see here, hopefully, two future laparoscopic surgeons practicing. And of course, action video games are also good at teaching effective response. There is converging data that violent video games increase aggressive tendencies. We see that in correlation studies, experimental studies, and longitudinal studies. Violent gamers are more aggressive. Non-gamers' aggression increases when they play violent video games. And longitudinally, aggressive tendencies vary with the amount of violent video game playing that's been undertaken at that time. It doesn't mean that we can say that the Columbine massacre was because, or the awful massacre in Norway was because the perpetrators played violent video games, which they did. We can't prove that link. All we can say is that playing violent video games increases aggressive tendencies. We can't say it actually caused somebody to carry out a violent act. But similarly, pro-social games teach empathy, and we have a similar set of evidence to show that as well. So video games are really good teachers, and they don't always teach what we want them to teach, but they are good. So if we can actually tackle and find out why and how and capture that magic genie and put it into our classrooms, then there's a great future ahead, I believe. Now, what's interesting is that although kids and adults love 50-50 chances, those are the things that are going to get us most excited, and we can see that in human studies. In schools, children don't like that level of uncertainty. Actually, it's been measured, and it's around about 90%, 87% in this study. If you give children a whole different set of problems of different difficulty, they will choose the ones, mostly, that are around 90%. 100% is too boring. 80%, it starts introducing these issues of self and social esteem, which you don't get in games because there's such a great chance element. Now, the trouble with that comfort zone of 90%, because it's still useful, it rehearses learning, but the trouble with it is that you don't get that dopamine emotional response, that I want that visceral motivation. But it does suggest a learning games approach to teaching in which we can introduce chance, thus increasing uncertainty while protecting esteem. So do children prefer chance-based uncertainty in learning? Well, we carried out a study where we asked them to choose their maths questions from Mr. Certain or Mr. Uncertain. Mr. Uncertain would give them a point if it was correct. Mr. Uncertain would toss a coin if it was correct, and either they'd get 2 points for heads or no points for tails. And as the session progressed, so children more and more wanted to ask their questions from Mr. Uncertain. They preferred that mode of learning. And that's quite sort of controversial, certainly in terms of our Ofsted principles of reward consistency as underpinning motivation. Neuroscience is actually telling us something else. Reward consistency does not underpin motivation. It's actually more complicated than that. Before we actually were able to apply this in the classroom, we had to carry out our own brain imaging studies because the neuroscience was not complete. It wasn't telling us some of the questions, the answers that we needed to some important questions. One of them was, how do we respond to the performance of our competitors? Because actually in classrooms, when we're playing learning games, we are quite often competing. do we see similar reward responses? Now, without going into the details, neuroscience was saying yes, but they will be the same as our own reward responses. So, essentially, if your competitor gets an unexpected success, you should see your reward response generated as if it was your own success. Now, common sense tells us that that's really not likely, but that's what the neuroscience theory was telling us. Now, what we found, of course, was the reverse. Our reward response was in relation to our competitors' unexpected failures, not their unexpected successes. What was really interesting is that when the competitor did unexpectedly succeed, and that's a very good opportunity for learning because they've done something which unexpectedly has produced some reward, and so you can learn from that and reproduce it and imitate it. Actually, there was no activation increase anywhere in the brain. Even when we turned it down to turned it up to a really high statistical threshold, we couldn't see anything at all. So it seems that instinctively we learn from our own successes and our competitors' failures. Of course, we have higher conscious processes, so we can do something about that, but that's probably our first instinct. We carried out other bridging studies as well, because this is quite controversial in a way. You can imagine all sorts of issues of fairness with children saying, well, hang on, actually, I knew the answer, I should have a point. But in our method of teaching, actually, when you get the correct answer, you win the opportunity to on a chance-based system, to win a point. You don't just get a point. And what we found, though, was that when we introduced chance-based uncertainty, we got this emergence of sport talk around learning. So that when the children were losing, they would say, well, it's just bad luck. But when they were winning, they would say, well, it's just because we're absolutely brilliant. You know, this is the sort of thing when you hear football fans, or actually football players, sometimes talking in those sorts of terms. But chance was not seen as unfair. Is it just a superficial sugar coating on the bitter pill of learning? No, it doesn't appear that it is. When we wired up adults and looked at their skin response, their emotional response, what we found was that the emotional response to the gaming element was significant, yes, but also when you put the learning in a gaming context, the emotional response to the learning is also enhanced. So it actually transforms the emotional experience of the learning as well. And the theory is strong enough for us to be able to use neurocomputational models of the brain and predict when somebody is going to learn and be able to recall information during a learning game. So we went into schools and we started developing practice based around these ideas. And the first thing we used was a Wheel of Fortune. And, you'd spin the Wheel of Fortune and, children could basically game their winnings if they got the answer correct. And if it landed on a purple, they'd get double. And if they landed on a zero, then they'd lose their winnings. And also we could choose individual teams for special challenges. We gave away points sometimes just on the basis of picking lucky colours. So we said pick one of the colours, red, blue, green, yellow, and if they pick the lucky colour, they get points. So we basically disrupted that relationship between getting the answers correct and getting the points. So it was very unpredictable what was going to happen. And we had fantastic motivation. The children were really very, very engaged, eyes front, lots of screaming, lots of really good fun. Absolutely no learning was achieved whatsoever. And this is why you can't take neuroscience and just apply it in the classroom. You need to work with teachers and integrate teacher expertise, understanding about learning. And of course, the deputy head was standing at the door saying, this is just like an end-of-term quiz, really. And yeah, it is really. This is not working out at all. And of course, what we had forgotten, really, was to try to identify those moments when the children were going to be experiencing those dopamine ramps, that anticipation, and use those to focus in on the learning as learning opportunities, teachable moments. And so that's really when we started developing the pedagogy around teaching through games. And the other problem was that we were throwing out plastic tokens all the time, trying to keep scores, and it was very unmanageable. So we then developed a PowerPoint-based piece of software that would allow us to keep the scores of each team, as well as providing, that's the purple button there, as well as providing a way of bringing about a chance-based outcome. So what happens is that the teams decide what they think the answer to the question is, that the teacher then inputs that onto the screen. It's particularly good if you use an interactive whiteboard. And then the outcome is announced, but an important part of the teaching is to actually go through the incorrect answers first, because that's when the dopamine is ramping up, and that's an excellent teaching opportunity. And then those people who have decided that they will game their points, you press the purple button and you find out if the gamers have doubled or lost. You don't have to game your points, so that's a decision that you also have to make. We tried this out in North Wales, and I've got a sort of a little video, hopefully, that will show you this working. If I just get rid of that, will that? Oh, okay.
What we are doing is something a little bit different, okay, for one of the topics that we're working on this week, which is going to be conduction. The reason it's moving is because it has more energy. The more energy it has, the more it will move. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that information now for our next question. Which of the type of burn is due to conduction? So if you think it's yellow, hanging by a rope from a helicopter over the top of a lava flow or something such as that. We've got sunburn, right, holiday in the sun for something like what happened to me, melted my thumbprint off. Is that conduction? So burn by hot dinner plate. Okay. Team 3, where are you? Who wants to game? Okay, no changing out final answers now. Acid burn. I'm sorry. Basically what acids do, guys, is they steal water from you. Okay, generate a bit of heat as well. Alright? Conduction? No. How about if I was to get sunburned by touching the sun? I know I can't, but would that be conduction? Yeah. Okay. So the answer obviously is burn by the dinner plate. Okay. Okay, running totals. Better let you know, haven't we?
Right, I just have to get back now. Okay, so these are some of the principles that have arisen from this work. We know that the effects of dopamine are very brief, so we need to closely intermingle the learning and the gaming. They have to be as closely intermingled as possible. Use uncertain reward to generate dopamine ramps. Sorry, DA stands for dopamine. That we also use rising stakes throughout the game, because the effects of dopamine are context specific. You get as much dopamine for £10 if you think you're going to win it, if that's the maximum prize available, as you would for £100 if that's the maximum prize available, or 100 points. So the maximum dopamine hit, if you like, is proportional to the maximum reward available in that context, which means you don't have to offer chocolate bars or anything, because it's all about whatever is being offered in the game. But that also means that you can increase what's being offered in the game as you go along, which is a standard game show tactic. For example, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You know, they start off at 500,000, 10,000, and it goes up like that. It also makes the outcome completely unpredictable. And it means that those children quite often who have never normally win can win, and those children who get fed up with winning because it's a bit uncool can lose. But even if they win, it seems to be more cool. And the reward response when observing competitors we know is driven by losses. So we quite often choose individual teams for individual challenges, and we choose those randomly, of course. But we make sure the question is really difficult. So there's a good likelihood they're going to lose, but we balance that up with an awful lot of points if they happen to win. So you can use the neuroscience, the science, to actually drive the principles of the learning and the teaching. Now, as I say, we've tried this out. It's very difficult to know what to compare it to. We're still developing practice. We know that we get good learning games. We know when we teach whole units of work. So, for example, we've taught heat energy, we've taught trigonometry, a whole unit of work over like 4 lessons through this method. We know that the children at the end of it will say, yeah, this is great. Actually, we want to learn like this all the time. But there's still a lot more research to be done. One thing we have found is that boys are particularly interested in this method of learning. And one of the reasons for that is that the male reward system develops in a different way to the female reward system. So around puberty, we believe that ovarian hormones feminize the girl's reward system, and that doesn't happen in a boy. So there's a sense in which girls grow up to be women, but boys will be boys. And you can sometimes see that in the way in which girls put away their Nintendos and their game consoles when they're around 12 or 13. My daughter's put hers away now. She's like 13. But the boys, 15, 16, are still, hammering away with their thumbs. And in fact, what we see in this image is difference between male and female activity when playing video games in young people. That's the top slide. And if there's a warm colour, red or yellow or orange, that's where the male brain is more active than the female brain. If it's a green, cool colour, that's where the female brain is more active, but there is no region where the female brain is more active when playing a video game. In the bottom images, you see the functional connectivity, which is perhaps more important. So the male brain is more connected in all of those regions. You can see there's one green spot where the female brain is more connected than the male brain, and that's in the orbitofrontal cortex, quite often associated with emotional-based decision-making. And one of the things that we have found in other bits of research we've done is that when girls play games, they do so with a much greater social awareness, and so there's a lot more going on in the game than just the game, which can confuse us males sometimes. but it's very much about a social interaction with the person that they're playing with. Now, things have moved on so rapidly in this area that people often ask me, can you send the slides a couple of months beforehand? And there's no point in doing that because things have moved on by then. So this is the new part, if you like, is that in the last few weeks, Sogndal, which you can get to using this web address, www.sogndal.com, are now working with me to develop a much better version of this software than the one that I was using. And the wonderful thing is that the Sogndal site have already, over the last 2 or 3 years, been generating learning games for learners to help them with their revision. And the Sogndal site allows students to create their own learning content, basically their own questions, or choose from 16,000 topics that have already been created by other users. This is a free site. Having selected the learning content, or made your own learning content, you then choose from 40 games through which to learn it. By the way, has anybody come across this site before? Can you put your hand up if you have come across this site? Okay, just 2, that's interesting. And the teacher, there's now a sort of teacher interface to it as well, so the teacher can also log on as a teacher and organise their children's learning and monitor their children's learning, set games. Sorry, it doesn't have to be children, it could be students. I should say as well that this approach I use with postgraduate neuroscience students, so it's suitable for all ranges. It's been tried from 6 years old to, 46 or whatever, however old my postgraduate neuroscience students are. And it's very popular, so there's no age limit on using it. So they have now developed a much better version of this called Team Play. Now, this is it only came on last week. It's a beta version. It's available in 2 skins, so basically this is the same game, but it's in a different appearance, if you like, Game Show and Desert Challenge. And it works on the same basis. Because it's very new, the beta users have all been sent notification that they need to look at the videos. So I have to say to you as well, it's really important to watch the videos of how it's put together. And they're not very easy to see. So if you go to the front page, I just want to point out that it's down there in the bottom left-hand corner. You'll find something called video tutorials. And one of those tutorials, actually several of them, is for Team Play. And it's really worth reading those before you try it out. But it allows you to teach any topic through gaming to your class. And you can see, actually, just from the graphics, that this is a far superior thing than was available before. If you're interested in knowing more about neuroscience and education generally, the top book is very good, Introducing Neuroeducational Research. If you want to know more about the effects of digital technology on the brain, then you can go to Lulu and buy this book. But if you want to teach through gaming, then I would really recommend going to the Sogndal site, looking at those videos, but also there's information about that which is also free on this www.neuroeducational.net site. So that was everything that I wanted to tell you, but I suspect that there's a couple of questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Perfect timing. Mark has a microphone, so if anybody would like to ask Paul any questions, just raise your hand.
Jerry, might have known. Okay, thank you. That was a very stimulating and interesting presentation. I'm curious whether there's a predisposition of games learning towards boys from what you described of the dopamine experience, and therefore they are more successful in those environments than girls are. Is that the case?
Yeah, we haven't fully explored the gender issues. There is some very tempting and suggestive aspects of the data that we're getting. So, for example, it always seems to be the case that the boys respond more than the girls to reward uncertainty. Well, not always, but overall, on average. But, for example, in the Denbighshire study we did in North Wales, which was the video clip you saw, we did about 3 sessions, 3 different topics with different age groups. And in all of them, the boys, on average, learnt more than the girls, but it didn't reach statistical significance. It's one of those annoying things. So my guess is that if you did a massive study, you would see a statistically significant difference between boys and girls learning in those areas. But I think there's also another interesting aspect to this, that we have in some areas a widening gender divide between boys and girls. So we often worry about boys' underachievement now in schools, but not out of schools, interestingly. But within schools, we have done our utmost to develop reward consistency. In fact, schools in some senses represent a very unnatural environment. It's about the only place, really, where you should be guaranteed a point if you have a right answer, that reward consistency. In real life, it's not like that. For example, coming here today, you didn't know who you were going to meet. I didn't know, who I was going to meet. When you go for a job interview, you can be the best candidate, but there can be an inside candidate, or you can just feel unlucky on the day, the interview doesn't go down too well, you said the wrong thing. There are lots of chance aspects in life that make life interesting and also give us the motivational discourse to be able to say when we walk out, when it doesn't work out, well, we were just unlucky. It's not true in schools. We have had a belief that reward consistency in schools underpins motivation, but I think that belief is orientated more by a sense of social justice than actually the facts as they are now coming through from neuroscience. So we have to really rethink how we use reward in schools, and I think when we start doing that, we might see that gender gap actually disappear.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for that. I saw you speak at Learn Without Frontiers. I thought it was fantastic. In fact, I just bought your book just there. Good stuff. The examples that you gave on there and the examples that you gave from the Sogndal site were all multiple choice questions. I just wondered if there were any other kind of games mechanics that different ways of doing it.
Yeah, there really are. I mean, the Sogndal, the prototype has other features to it. So one of them is a bonus round where you can just pick a colour randomly, so the children can decide which colour is their lucky colour. Then they get points when you spin the wheel and they see which colour comes up. But more importantly for learning, it's also possible to randomly identify teams, but also set up creativity rounds, discussion rounds, debating rounds. So, for example, in a debating round, you can have two statements, neither of which are provably true. They're more like opinions or whatever. You get two teams in the class chosen randomly to debate them, and then the class chooses votes for which they prefer, and the points are awarded for the most popular argument or the most popular speaker, not for the correct answer. So those sorts of rounds really encourage discussion. I mean, there's also, actually we've done a whole lesson of thinking skills, developing thinking skills using this approach as well. So multiple choice questions may appear limited, but actually it's known that they can test all levels of understanding according to Bloom's taxonomy, and it's really just the imagination of how you use them. So we also have creativity rounds where we have a head-to-head match between two people trying to think up as many metaphors as they can for love, for example, and the person who can think up the most in the time limit sort of wins or whatever. So it's much more flexible than I've been able to describe it this morning. And of course, I mean, I think now Sogndal are involved, it's going to rapidly develop as well. So what's on there in a month's time is likely to be better again.
I think we're just about time running out. I just want to thank Paul again. That's absolutely really interesting, fascinating.
Okay, thank you very much. Cheers.